The storm came without warning, tearing across New York with violent winds and sheets of rain. In a penthouse overlooking the city, William Carter sat in the dark, staring at nothing. 1 year had passed since the day he buried his daughter, and every night since felt like punishment. He thought grief had shown him its sharpest edges until that knock. At first, he ignored it. No one ever came here anymore. Then the knock came again, desperate, shaky. William opened the door. What he saw nearly dropped him to his knees. A girl stood there, dripping wet hair plastered to her cheeks. Her voice cracked as she whispered, "Sir, I haven't eaten in 2 days. Could you give me some bread?" The words should have been simple, but they weren't. Because when William looked into her face, he saw his daughter, the one he had lost, the one who was supposed to be gone forever. Imagine that moment. Would you believe your eyes or your grief? Comment what you would do, because the truth in this story will take turns no one sees coming. Thunder cracked above, shaking the glass. The girl flinched, pulling a thin coat tighter. William should have stepped back, closed the door, called someone. Instead, he found himself moving aside, letting her in. The warmth of the hallway seemed to startle her more than the storm. She introduced herself softly. Isabella. No last name, no home. She said she had run from an orphanage in Brooklyn, tired of being sent from house to house where she never belonged. She had wandered until the storm forced her to knock on a stranger's door. William listened, unable to take his eyes off her. The resemblance to his daughter wasn't just in her features. It was in the way she held herself, the way she chewed her lip when nervous, the way her gaze darted between him and the floor. Every gesture felt like a memory resurrected. Minnie Hook. William wasn't just looking at a hungry child. He was staring at an echo of the life he had lost. And echoes have a way of demanding to be heard. He led her into the kitchen, hands shaking as he reached for things he hadn't touched in months. Milk, cocoa, crackers. He hadn't made hot chocolate since before the accident, but tonight he did. Isabella cupped the mug with both hands, steam rising against her face. For the first time, she looked at him directly. And there it was, the spark he remembered, the very one that once lit up his world. He almost had to look away. His chest felt like it was splitting open. She explained between sips that she had left the orphanage because another transfer was coming. She didn't want to start over again. "They won't notice I'm gone until tomorrow," she said. The shrug that followed was so painfully familiar, William had to grip the counter to steady himself. His daughter had done the same whenever she tried to act brave. He nearly broke then. Nearly told the girl everything, who she looked like, why she was breaking him open. But instead he asked, "Are you warm enough?" His voice cracked. She nodded, though she kept shivering. Minnie Hook. This wasn't a coincidence. It couldn't be. Either grief had finally driven him mad, or fate had just stepped into his living room. The storm outside raged louder, lightning flashing across the walls. Isabella finished the last cracker, and then something happened that pulled the air from his lungs. She smiled. It was crooked, uneven, just a little lopsided, the exact smile his daughter used to have. William turned away quickly, his hand gripping the sink. He hadn't smiled back in a year. He wasn't sure he even remembered how. But now, watching this girl, he felt something stir, something terrifying and fragile. Hope. She caught him staring. "Why are you looking at me like that?" she asked, suspicion flashing in her eyes. He swallowed hard. The truth slipped out before he could stop it. "Because you remind me of someone I loved more than anything." The silence that followed was heavier than the storm. Isabella lowered her gaze, as if afraid she had intruded on something sacred. The clock ticked past midnight. Rain pounded the windows. and William Carter realized this was no ordinary night. A stranger had begged him for bread. But what she brought inside was far more than hunger. She was a mirror of his past, a mystery wrapped in flesh and blood. A knock had opened a door that grief had locked shut, and once opened it could never be closed again. So let me ask you, if fate gave you this moment, would you take it, or would you turn away? Because William Carter was about to make a choice that would shatter everything he thought he knew about loss, about love, and about second chances. The house was never meant to be this quiet. William Carter had grown used to silence in the years since his daughter's death. But that night, with Isabella sitting at the kitchen table, the silence felt different. It wasn't empty. It was waiting. He watched her sip the last of the hot chocolate, her hands wrapped around the mug as though she was afraid it might vanish. Her eyes darted around the room, taking in the photographs on the wall, the polished marble counters, the tall windows with rain still hammering against them. For a child who had begged for bread an hour earlier, it must have looked like another world. She set the cup down gently as if afraid to break it. "Do you always live here alone?" she asked. The question was simple, but it sliced through William. He nodded slowly. Yes, that single word carried the weight of 12 empty months of dinners, untouched, of rooms frozen in time. Isabella lowered her gaze, almost as if she had touched something fragile and didn't know how to fix it. William rose from his chair, forcing himself to steady his voice. "Come," he said. "Let me find you something dry to wear." He led her down the hallway to a guest room, though, in truth, it had been untouched for years. He opened a wardrobe and hesitated. Most of the clothes inside belonged to his daughter, things he hadn't been able to pack away. Isabella stepped closer, her eyes landing on a pale blue pajama set, folded neatly on the shelf. "May I?" she asked softly. For a moment, William couldn't breathe. The pajamas had been a birthday gift never worn. He wanted to say no, to protect them like he had protected every memory, but the words wouldn't come. He simply nodded. When she emerged from the bathroom a few minutes later, the pajamas hung loose on her thin frame, but she smiled shyly. For a fleeting second, William thought he was looking at his daughter again, as if the last year had been nothing more than a nightmare he could wake from. The thought both comforted and terrified him. Minnie Hook. Memory has a cruel way of blurring the line between what was lost and what still remains. And that night William found himself caught in that blur. Isabella looked around the room before settling onto the bed, her small hands smoothing the blanket. "This feels safe," she whispered, as though she didn't quite believe it. William lingered in the doorway, torn between wanting to stay and knowing he should give her space. He finally managed rest. "You're safe here tonight." She gave a tiny nod, curling under the covers. Within minutes, exhaustion pulled her into sleep. But William didn't sleep. He stood in the hallway listening to the sound of her breathing through the cracked door. His mind raced. Every instinct told him she was just a runaway girl, a stranger who happened to carry the shadow of someone he loved. Yet the resemblance was too sharp, the timing too cruel. He found himself returning to the doorway over and over, as though afraid she might vanish if he looked away. The storm outside finally broke, leaving only the drip of rain against the windows. The silence pressed heavier than before, but William wasn't alone in it anymore. He walked into his late daughter's room for the first time in months. The scent of lavender still lingered. Her books were stacked neatly, her drawings taped to the wall. He sat on the edge of her bed, staring at a photo of her grinning with cake smeared across her cheeks. The weight of memory settled on him, crushing and strangely alive at once. He whispered into the empty room, "What are you trying to tell me?" Back in the guest room, Isabella stirred. Her dreams must have been restless, because when William checked on her again, she was mumbling words he couldn't quite catch. He stepped closer. "Grace," she whispered, "wait for me." The name shot through him like lightning. Grace had been his daughter's middle name when no one at the orphanage could have known. His pulse hammered in his ears. He backed away, shaken, gripping the doorframe to steady himself. Minnie Hook. Coincidence was one thing. But when a stranger in your home calls out your daughter's name in her sleep, coincidence no longer feels like an answer. William returned to the kitchen, pouring himself a glass of scotch he didn't really want. His reflection in the window looked older than his years, worn thin by grief. Yet tonight something else flickered there too, fear, and beneath it a dangerous spark of hope. He had locked hope away 12 months ago. He wasn't ready to unlock it again. But Isabella's presence had forced it open, and now it refused to leave. The hours crawled by. At dawn, the city lights softened against a gray sky. William brewed coffee, his hand steady, for the first time in months. He hadn't realized how much he had missed the simple act of preparing something for someone else. Isabella padded into the kitchen, still in the blue pajamas, her hair tangled, but her eyes brighter. She looked at the toast and eggs on the table as if it were a feast. "Is this for me?" she asked. William nodded, forcing a small smile. She ate carefully, almost ceremoniously, as if every bite mattered. Watching her, he felt the strangest sensation, like the house itself was waking up. The quiet halls didn't seem quite as hollow, the light through the windows not as harsh. When she finished, Isabella wiped her mouth and glanced at the photographs on the wall. One in particular caught her eye, a portrait of William's daughter taken in Central Park, sunflowers towering behind her. Isabella froze her hand, hovering just short of the frame. "She looks like me," she whispered. The tremor in her voice was undeniable. William's breath caught. He didn't answer. He couldn't. His silence spoke louder than words ever could. Minnie Hook. A girl begging for bread had found herself in a stranger's home. But by sunrise she was no longer a stranger. She was a reflection. And reflections have a way of uncovering truths long buried. That first night ended not with certainty, but with questions that clung to every corner of the house. William had opened his door to a child in need, but what entered was far more than hunger and fear. It was memory brought to life, echoing through every room. And as Isabella sat at the table, her eyes shifting from the portrait to him, William Carter understood that his life had crossed a line. Nothing would be the same again. Morning light filled the penthouse, but William Carter felt no ease in it. The storm had passed, yet something far more unsettling remained. Isabella sat across the table, her small hands folded around the mug he'd given her, her eyes drawn to every corner of the house as if she had lived there before. It wasn't only her resemblance to his daughter that disturbed him now. It was the way she seemed woven into his life as if she had always belonged here. After breakfast, Isabella wandered toward the grand piano in the living room. The lid had stayed closed for a year untouched since the day William lost his daughter. She lifted it carefully as though she knew it mattered. Her fingers pressed the keys, hesitant at first, then striking a melody that stopped William in his tracks. It wasn't random notes, it was the lullaby he used to hum at night, the same one he hadn't sung aloud since the funeral. Where did you learn that his voice came out harsher than he intended? Isabella looked startled, her hands freezing above the keys. "I don't know," she said. I hear it in my head sometimes, in dreams." William's skin went cold. Dreams. The same melody, the same name she had whispered in her sleep the night before. It was impossible, yet undeniable. That evening, after Isabella had gone to bed, William sat alone in his study. He stared at his phone for a long time before finally making the call. His voice was steady, but his hands shook. He told the lab technician he needed a DNA test, quiet, discreet, no questions asked. He clipped a strand of Isabella's hair while she slept and sealed it in an envelope. Minnie Hook. Some truths hide in the dark, waiting for the courage to uncover them. William wasn't sure he wanted answers, but he knew he couldn't live with questions anymore. The days that followed were filled with uneasy waiting. Isabella stayed in the house, filling the halls with a presence that was both comforting and haunting. She explored the library, pulling down books far too heavy for her arms. She stood at the window for hours, staring out at the skyline as though searching for something beyond it. She asked questions about the house, about the photographs, about the girl in them who looked just like her. William gave vague answers, never quite lying, never fully telling the truth. At night, she would sit cross-legged on the rug, scribbling drawings in a small notebook she carried. One evening, she handed him a page. It was a picture of two girls, hand in hand, standing beneath a bright yellow sun. "She comes to me in my dreams," Isabella explained. "She laughs like me. She even talks like me. Do you think maybe I have a sister out there somewhere?" William's throat closed. He managed a tight nod, but the weight of her words cut deep. He knew she wasn't imagining. She was remembering. The call from the lab came on a gray Thursday afternoon. William shut himself in his study before answering. The technician's voice was calm, professional, unknowing of the storm these results would unleash. The test confirmed what his heart already suspected. Isabella was his daughter, his flesh and blood. The evidence was undeniable. He sat in silence after the call, staring at the papers on his desk. Relief should have come, but it didn't. Instead, shame rose in his chest, heavy and relentless. Because if Isabella was his daughter, then someone somewhere had kept her from him all these years, and he had allowed it. Minnie Hook DNA had given him truth, but truth without answers only deepened the wound. Someone held the missing piece, and William knew exactly who that someone might be. Her name came back to him like a whisper from the past, Maria Alvarez. He hadn't spoken it in more than a decade, but the memory was still sharp. Maria, the woman he once loved, the woman he had turned away when responsibility threatened to upend his career and his reputation. She had left without explanation, disappearing into silence. And now, in the shadow of Isabella's eyes, William realized Maria had never truly left. That night, he couldn't hide the turmoil on his face. Isabella noticed. "Did I do something wrong?" she asked timidly. The question shattered him. He knelt before her, taking her hands. "No, you've done nothing wrong. You've done everything right." His voice broke, and he had to turn away before she saw the tears. In the still hours before dawn, William searched his records, his memory, any clue that could lead him back to Maria. A library in Princeton came up in the results. She was there working quietly, her life built far from the chaos of his own. He stared at the screen, his heart pounding. Minnie Hook. To uncover the truth of the present, William would have to walk back into the shadows of his past. And he wasn't sure if he was ready for what Maria Alvarez would say when she saw him again. He returned to Isabella's room and watched her sleep, the pale blue pajamas rising and falling with each breath. She looked at peace, but he knew peace wouldn't last. Answers were coming. Questions long buried were clawing their way back into the light. And as much as he feared them, he knew one thing with certainty. The girl who had knocked on his door begging for bread wasn't a stranger. She was his child, his blood, his second chance. And he would follow every painful road necessary to prove it to her, to himself, and to the ghosts that still haunted him. The train ride to Princeton felt longer than it was. William Carter sat by the window, his reflection shifting with every mile, his mind tangled in questions that refused to quiet. The DNA results had given him certainty, But certainty without understanding was a heavier burden than doubt. Isabella was his daughter. But why had she grown up in an orphanage? Why had he been left to bury one child while another lived a life without him? Only one person could answer that, Maria Alvarez. He found her in the quiet hush of the library, her hair streaked with gray, her posture weary but steady. Time had marked her face, but her eyes were the same, dark, intelligent, guarded. When she saw him, her expression flickered between recognition and dread. For a long moment neither spoke. Then Maria broke the silence. "I wondered when you would find me." They sat across from each other at a long oak table. Between them lay years of silence, mistakes, and choices that could never be undone. William's voice was rough, carrying more regret than accusation. Why Maria? Why was she left in an orphanage? Why didn't I know Maria's hands trembled as she folded them together? "Because you made a choice," she said softly. "Back then, when I came to you, you said there was no room in your life. You had a daughter already. You had a career, a reputation. I walked away because I thought I had no place." Her eyes filled, but her tone hardened. "I was carrying twins, William. Did you ever stop to wonder if the life you rejected meant more than one child?" The words hit him like a physical blow. Twins. He remembered the night Maria left the arguments, the silence he forced to shield himself from shame. He had buried one daughter, not knowing another still breathed. Minnie Hook. Truth doesn't only cut it, carves open wounds you thought had healed. And William was bleeding with every word Maria spoke. She explained the rest with halting breaths. She had kept one child for a time, but struggled in poverty, unable to raise two alone. When tragedy and desperation collided, Isabella was left at the orphanage door. Maria had carried the guilt like a weight, too afraid to face William, too ashamed to disrupt the life she imagined he had built. "I thought she would find a family. I thought someone would love her the way I couldn't." William pressed his hands to his face. Rage burned, but so did sorrow. He wanted to condemn her, but he could see the truth. Maria had been young, scared, and alone. She had made a choice born of fear, and both of them had paid for it. When he returned to New York, Isabella sensed the heaviness in him. She sat on the living room rug, drawing as always, her voice quiet. "You found her, didn't you?" William didn't answer right away. Finally he said, "Yes." Isabella's eyes lifted, filled with both curiosity and fear. Why did she leave me? The question broke him. He sat beside her, pulling her close, because sometimes people make mistakes when they're afraid. She was afraid. I was afraid. But none of that changes who you are to me now. His voice cracked. "You are my daughter. Nothing will ever take that away." Isabella's hands clutched his shirt as she wept, and William held her as though holding both the child he had lost and the child he had found. For the first time, his grief loosened its grip. He realized he had spent a year clinging to a ghost, when in front of him was life itself, breathing, trembling, waiting to be claimed. Minnie Hook. Grief had written William's story for too long, but now love was rewriting the ending. The days that followed carried both tension and tenderness. Isabella tested him in small ways, asking if she could stay, then packing her few belongings, as if expecting him to send her away. Each time, William answered, not with promises but with presence. He showed her that the door would not close, not this time. They shared meals, laughter, breaking through the walls that had long silenced his home. She learned his rhythms. He learned her fears. Slowly, the house began to breathe again. Still, the road was not without conflict. One evening, Isabella asked bluntly, "If I had never knocked, would you have come for me?" The question was sharp, but William didn't hide from it. "I don't know," he admitted. "I can't change the past, but I can choose now, and now I will never let you go." That answer seemed to steady her more than any denial could have. Trust wasn't built overnight, but piece by piece, Isabella began to believe she belonged. William filed the paperwork for adoption, though the process was grueling. Social workers visited asking questions that scraped at his pride. Was he trying to replace the daughter he lost? Could he provide not just wealth, but stability, love, and patience? He answered with honesty. He admitted his grief, his mistakes, but also his commitment. Isabella was not a substitute. She was his daughter, his future, his chance to heal by giving her a home. Through it all, Maria appeared once more hesitant but willing to support what was right. She met Isabella privately, tears streaking her face as she whispered apologies a child should never have to hear. Isabella listened, quiet but strong, and finally said, "I forgive you, but I belong with him now." It was the clearest choice she had ever made. William witnessed it, his heart breaking and mending all at once. Forgiveness did not erase the past, but it freed them all to step forward. The night the court finalized the adoption, William brought Isabella home under the name she chose for herself, Isabella Grace Carter. She stood in the doorway of her new room, not a museum of memories, but a space painted fresh with books, music, and sunlight pouring in. She turned to him and said, "It feels like home." William smiled, tears blurring his vision. "It is home. You are home." Minnie Hook. Two souls broken by loss and time had found each other again. And in that bond, they discovered something stronger than grief, something that would carry them into a new beginning. The bond was not made of blood alone, though blood had revealed the truth. It was built in the quiet nights, the shared laughter, the courage to face pain together. William knew the road ahead would not always be easy, but for the first time in a year he looked forward instead of back. He no longer measured life by what he had lost, but by what he had found. And sitting beside him, smiling through tears, was Isabella, his daughter, his redemption, his second chance at love that grief could never erase. Spring came to New York with the kind of quiet promise William Carter hadn't felt in years. For months he had lived in the gray shadow of grief, but now the air in his penthouse was alive again. The walls that had once seemed like tombstones for memory now held the rhythm of footsteps, the sound of laughter, the clatter of dishes in the kitchen. Isabella's presence was no longer fragile or uncertain. It was rooted, steady, real. The adoption papers arrived in a plain envelope, but for William it felt like a golden seal on his second chance. Isabella opened it herself, tracing her new name with trembling fingers, Isabella Grace Carter. She read it aloud, her voice unsteady at first, but growing stronger, as if claiming it piece by piece. "It feels right," she said, and in that moment William felt something inside him lift like a stone finally rolled away. He knew he had to take her to a place he had avoided for far too long. One Saturday morning, hand in hand, they walked through Central Park until they reached the Memorial Garden. William carried sunflowers bright and defiant against the green of spring. At the gravestone, Isabella knelt, brushing away leaves. She didn't cry. She simply rested the flowers and whispered, "I think she saved my place." William's chest tightened as he lowered beside her. He had come here countless times alone, drowning in silence, but today was different. The space between loss and life had finally closed. Minnie Hook grief once chained William to the past, but standing with Isabella at that grave, he understood love had broken those chains, and home was no longer haunted. Back at the penthouse, transformation was everywhere. The room that had been sealed for a year was now Isabella's sanctuary. The walls, once covered in fading drawings, now held fresh colors, her new sketches taped proudly beside the old. A bookshelf stood in the corner lined with novels she had picked out on their weekend trips. The piano, once mute, filled the evenings with tentative melodies, Isabella practicing as William listened from his chair, coffee cooling in his hand. The rituals of family returned slowly but surely. Breakfast wasn't just toast and coffee anymore, it was eggs, sizzling orange juice poured into mismatched glasses, Isabella teasing William about his habit of reading the paper aloud. At night, instead of empty silence, the apartment glowed with movie marathons and debates about which ice cream flavor was superior. Life wasn't loud, but it was alive. William found himself changing in ways he hadn't expected. At work, colleagues noticed a shift, less of the cold, distant executive, more of a man who carried light in his eyes. He spoke less about deals and more about stories Isabella had told him. At home, he noticed his own habits softening. He no longer lived inside the shadow of what was lost. He lived inside the presence of what had been found. One evening, Isabella surprised him by baking bread. The smell filled the apartment golden and warm, seeping into every corner like sunlight. When she pulled it from the oven, she set the loaf on the table with a grin. "I figured since I begged for bread that night, I should learn to make it myself." William laughed a sound that had once felt foreign. "This is better than anything money ever bought," he told her, and he meant it. Minnie Hook bread had once been a symbol of survival, but now in their home it had become a symbol of belonging. The bond between them wasn't perfect, but it was unshakable. There were moments of tension of Isabella testing boundaries, of William learning patience he hadn't known he possessed. But every challenge carried them closer, shaping their bond into something strong enough to hold against the storms of the future. On the 1-year anniversary of Isabella's knock at his door, William planned something simple but profound. He took her to the rooftop garden, where the city stretched wide beneath them, the skyline glowing. He handed her a sunflower, the same flower she had placed at the grave months earlier. "Do you know what these mean?" he asked. She tilted her head. "What?" "They mean loyalty," William said quietly. "They mean someone who stands no matter the storm." Isabella twirled the stem in her hands, her smile steady. "Then we'll always have sunflowers," she said. William pulled her close, the city lights surrounding them like stars. For the first time in years, he felt whole. The journey had come full circle. He had opened his door to a child begging for bread, but what he found was not just hunger, it was his daughter, his redemption, his home. And as Isabella leaned against him, the sound of her laughter carrying into the night, William Carter knew the truth. Love had the power to turn loss into life, emptiness into belonging. He had been given a second chance, and he would never waste it. So here's the question. I leave with you. If fate knocked on your door in the form of a hungry child, would you open it or would you walk away? Leave your answer below, and if this story touched your heart, share it. Because love, when it comes full circle, is the one story worth telling again and again. The story of William Carter and Isabella Grace. Carter begins with a storm and a knock at the door, but what it truly reveals is the unpredictable power of second chances. William, once a man defined by grief and silence, believed his life had ended the day he buried his daughter. He filled his days with empty routines, his house with untouched relics, and his heart with regret. Yet destiny had other plans. One stormy night when lightning rattled his windows, and the world outside felt as broken as the world inside him, a frail girl appeared at his doorstep, asking for bread. In that moment, William faced a choice to turn away and protect his fragile heart, or to open the door and risk it breaking again. He chose to open it, and with that single act of compassion his life began to change. What followed was a journey filled with echoes of the past and fragile glimpses of hope. Isabella wasn't just any child. Her smile, her mannerisms, even the way she filled the silence seemed to resurrect what William had lost. At first, it was unbearable. Memories pressed against him like ghosts. Yet, as he allowed her presence to weave into his days, something shifted. The silence that once suffocated him began to soften. Laughter returned, timid at first, then stronger, until the house itself seemed alive again. William realized that grief doesn't disappear by being locked away. It begins to heal when it is shared, when memories are spoken aloud, when love, even in a different form, is allowed to return. The truth of Isabella's past brought both shock and redemption. She wasn't simply a stranger who reminded him of his daughter. She was his daughter. Flesh of his flesh, blood of his blood, the child of a past mistake buried in secrecy, now standing before him with open hands. That revelation could have crushed him with guilt. Instead, it gave him purpose. He could not rewrite the past, but he could choose to be present now. He could give her what she had been denied for so long, a father, a family, and a home. As days turned into weeks, William and Isabella built their bond, not through grand gestures, but through the smallest, most ordinary rituals. Baking bread on a Sunday morning, watching movies under blankets, talking late into the night about dreams, fears, and even silly things that only mattered in the moment. These were the bricks of their new life together. And when the adoption papers were signed, when Isabella proudly took the name Isabella Grace Carter, it was not just a legal formality, it was a declaration. They were no longer two broken souls drifting apart. They were a family. The story comes full circle when Isabella, standing before her sister's grave, whispered words that captured the heart of their journey. "Thank you for saving my place." In that simple line lay the truth. Love had not vanished with death. It had made space for healing, for continuity, for new beginnings. The home that once felt like a shrine of sorrow became a sanctuary of life. William didn't stop grieving his daughter, but he learned grief and joy could coexist. One child was gone, but her presence lived on in the love he now gave to Isabella. The lesson here is profound. Life is not a straight line. It is a series of losses and gains, endings and beginnings, storms and calm skies. What defines us is not the pain we endure, but what we choose to do with it. William could have closed the door that night and continued living in silence. Instead, he opened it and discovered that sometimes redemption arrives in the most unexpected form. For you, watching this, the takeaway is simple but powerful. Second chances are real, but they don't come wrapped in perfection. They come disguised as inconveniences, as risks, as messy interruptions. It could be a broken relationship waiting for forgiveness, a new opportunity you're afraid to take, or a person in your life who needs you more than you realize. The question is, will you open the door when it knocks? So I ask you directly, if you were in William's shoes, that stormy night, would you have opened the door? Would you have seen bread as just bread, or as the beginning of a miracle? Share your thoughts in the comments. I want to hear your perspective. And if this story touched your heart, if it reminded you of the beauty of second chances and the strength of love, then I invite you to subscribe to this channel. By subscribing, you're not just supporting these stories, you're helping us bring more tales of hope, redemption, and inspiration to life. Hit that subscribe button, join our community, and let's keep walking this journey together. Because sometimes the most extraordinary transformations begin with the smallest act of kindness. And who knows, the next story might just be yours.